The Forever Winter is a horror extraction shooter set in the grimmest post-apocalypse that gaming has seen in years. It's a world of constant fighting and destruction, where you're a lonely scav trying to scrape by and survive while building up a small invisible community known as the Innards. The Forever Winter burst onto the scene, and it quickly became one of the most hyped games this year. It made big promises of harkening back to a past era of gaming, one unafraid to embrace the darkness. I was certainly excited. In fact, I made a video essay professing my excitement and to spread the word about the game, which I've never done before. I haven't been as excited for a game in a long time. Well, last month, the Forever Winter dropped into early access on Steam. And how has the response been? Well, it's been a bit mixed. Some big creators have put out videos stating that they don't like the game, and the Steam reviews have recently crawled their way to mostly positive, but they started at mixed. So in the broader gaming landscape, I think it would be safe to say that the Forever Winter hasn't quite lived up to the hype it had built up. And well, that's where I differ. Even in its early state, I think the Forever Winter is a truly special game. Already, it's very close to delivering the sort of experience I have been waiting years for. The Forever Winter is unique. It's a game unlike any I've ever played before. Above all, I guess, it's a game better than the sum of its parts. It's a game that doesn't just offer you an experience, but rather a journey through its world, through its gameplay systems. The best way to show you the Forever Winter is not by simply listing its pros and cons. Instead, I want you to trudge through its depths with me. I'm going to start off by telling you the story about my time with the Forever Winter, how I went from a lowly, inefficient scab to a survivor of these wastes, and how the game shines as a cohesive whole. Then I'll go more in depth on specific pros, and lastly, I'll move on to constructive criticism. This game is early, and there's certainly room to improve. Before I get started, I want to give a couple of caveats. First off, the game is in early access, and the developers have already updated the game and addressed some feedback. Given the time it takes for me to make these videos, some of my points may change or become outdated by its publication. Hence this video being titled an early critique. But I want to go over the experience I had with this game during its first month, so I think it's still valuable to cover everything, even that which has or will change. If nothing else, think of this video as a time capsule into the first month of the game. It can be used as a baseline for comparison in the future. Secondly, this is a game with co-op support. However, what I was really looking for in this game is an immersive single-player experience, so that's how I engage with the title. I believe what makes different views on a game unique are what each person is looking for, and well, this is it for me. I assume the co-op experience is like most games, where the fun is enhanced with friends. But I'm not the guy to tell you in this video. Okay, with those out of the way, let's dive into the Forever Winter. The Forever Winter begins with the tutorial mission. It opens with a simple message that sets the stage. You have found a viable home for you and your fellow scavs. Clear out the area and bring your blue water container to the water supply. This home is the Innards, and this tutorial is the start of your scav's journey. The storytelling of this opening message is terse, and this is a pattern that continues throughout the game. The tutorial teaches the very basics of the game, how to pick up and drop off items, how to shoot, and how to extract. It's a microcosm of the gameplay loop. Enter a zone with a mission, accomplish the task, and get the heck out. By the end of the tutorial, you understand the controls, but you still don't really have an idea of how to play the Forever Winter. That is a lesson that you can only learn through pain. With the innards cleared out, our small collective of scavs moves in. We're able to explore the hub world. Already, this little area highlights one of the Forever Winter's great strengths: environmental storytelling, and even above that, just creating this unique mood and vibe. The despair of this place is just palpable. Your fellow survivors are hanging on by the narrowest of threads. They're haggard with body language that screams exhaustion. This place seems like it's on the precipice of death. This feeling is strengthened by the imagery. The innards literally hangs on a precipice, overlooking a seemingly endless descent. All of this is punctuated by the message at the top right corner of the screen. The water reserves are dangerously low. If we don't fill them, everyone in the innards will die. This isn't just narrative dressing. Water is a critical part of survival in the innards, and it's part of the continuously creeping feeling of death that pervades every part of this game. But I'll speak more in depth on the water mechanic later. We meet Slade, our first quest giver. He wants us to recon the scorched enclaves and see if there's water there. In return, he'll dip into his personal water stash to help the innards. Here is another lesson about this world. Nobody gives freely. Everything has a price. If you want something, well, you're gonna have to do something in return. So we have our objective. The innards needs water. The storytelling gives us enough to understand the context of what we're doing and why, but it doesn't go much further. As I said, the storytelling is terse. It's a game that would rather show you its world than explain it, if that makes sense. I'm able to pick which level to deploy at via the region map. In this case, the mission is to scout out the Scorched Enclave, so I entered there. Immediately, I'm taken aback by the vista before me. I see the carcasses of long-dead skyscrapers. They're caked in so much dust and debris that they more so resemble rock formations. It's incredible how quickly and how succinctly the Forever Winter conveys its tone of dread with just a simple backdrop. My quest here is even simpler than the tutorial. I just need to extract from the Scorched Enclaves. It's a simple goal, get out. But accomplishing it well, that's an entirely different thing. As I said, the tutorial teaches you the basics of gameplay, but it doesn't teach you how to truly play the Forever Winter. It's a lesson you only learn through trial and failure. Lots of failure. My first attempt in this dark, hostile world lasted about a minute. I came across some cyborgs, got spooked, and discharged my weapon. Big mistake. I alerted all of the nearby cyborgs, along with another enemy faction. I was surrounded, overwhelmed, and killed in very short order. Another mistake is that I didn't even equip ammo in my loadout. I had one magazine in each weapon. It felt like a bucket of cold water had been splashed on my face. The Forever Winter's oppressive atmosphere wasn't just set dressing. The gameplay was oppressive to match. I wasn't too deterred yet. I redeployed on the mission, this time making sure to actually pack some spare mags. So how did my second attempt go? Well, it went arguably worse. Instead of firing right away, I decided to sneak through the level. I situated myself on a rock, watching my enemies fight each other before me. But then I froze here. There were so many enemies in front of me, and I didn't know where to go, not without entering their sights. So I simply watched and waited and waited. My enemies were focused on each other. I, a lone scav, was insignificant in comparison. I might be frozen, but I was at least safe. That was until the fighting stopped. Eventually, one of the factions was victorious. Their enemy was dead, and the chaos of battle receded. The base became deathly still. In the quiet, in the calm, well, they finally noticed me. 10 men against 1, isolated and alone. I didn't have a chance to even fire back. My second death, my second failure. At this point, despair started to grip me. I tried being aggressive and I failed. But I also tried being slow and quiet, but I also failed. These are the tried and true tactics in most other games. If neither one worked then, well, what was I supposed to do? I started to worry that maybe this game wasn't meant for me after all. Maybe I just didn't have the chops for this. But I wasn't going to give up, not just yet. I entered the Scorched Enclaves for a third time. The world was just as oppressive as before, perhaps even more so. There seemed to be even more enemies, even more chaos and gunfire. But something was different. This time the game clicked. See, even though my last attempt was a failure, I did learn something from it. While my enemies were fighting each other, they weren't paying attention to me. It was only when they weren't preoccupied, well, that's when they took an interest in little old me. In the run-up to the game's early access release, I had watched the promo videos about the game's complex enemy AI. In essence, they operate off a hierarchy of priority, targeting the most dangerous enemies first. You're at the bottom of the totem pole. That means, as long as you don't cause too much noise, or put yourself in a position that the enemies simply can't ignore, well, you'll largely be untouched. So I knew about this enemy AI system, but I didn't truly understand it. I didn't internalize it. When I was on top of that rock, seeing the gunfire below, well, I still froze. But here on this third extraction, I started to grasp it. This time I didn't make a lot of noise, but I also didn't stand still either. I didn't cower at the edge of the map. Instead, I cut straight through it. Head lowered, I ran straight through the heart of the beast. Gunfire and explosions surrounded me, and I was acutely aware of this fact, but I kept on running, having faith that my enemies were too busy with each other to worry about the lone scav. But my plan wasn't flawless. While creeping along a runway, there was an enemy I couldn't sneak past. I decided to take the chance and fired. After taking him out, the enemy rumbling around me grew louder. They would investigate, I knew, so I grabbed his gear and kept on moving. For the first time, I took out an enemy and got away with it. A barren zone lay between me and my extraction. There was no cover, no way to hide. So I made another sprint, gunfire once again surrounding me, and I reached the extraction point. My first successful extract. This run was one of the most exhilarating moments I've had in gaming in years. And here I started to understand the magic that the Forever Winter offers. It has a gameplay rhythm that is wholly unlike any other game I've played. It's not a full-on action game, nor is it a stealth game. You're in the thick of the action, but you're not a part of it. Not most of the time. At least not yet, not while you're weak and inexperienced. It's here, in the in-between, in the microsecond decisions of whether to run, to hide, or to fight, based on your enemies and what they're doing, where the magic of the Forever Winter lies. With the successful quest completed came more opportunities, more money to spend on better weapons to take into my next extraction, more XP to level up my character, and more quests to take on. Here, I started to get accustomed to the larger gameplay loop of the Forever Winter. This loop is pretty straightforward. Take on quests, explore regions, and complete quests or extract with good loot. Then sell your findings or take on another quest and repeat the process. All the while, make sure your water levels are high enough to not only keep everybody alive, but also unlock more vendors for even better gear. Although the loop is simple, it doesn't make it any less captivating. The reason why it's so captivating is that the Forever Winter nails progression better than any other game I've played in a long time. There are multiple systems of progression, and they each have a tangible effect on how you play the game while within a zone. The more quests you complete, the more quest givers you'll unlock. This opens up a greater variety of quests for you to take on. There are missions where you need to gather resources. There are missions that require you to find specific items. There are offensive missions where you need to take out a set number of enemy types or kill a boss enemy. Then there are more intricate quests. For instance, one has you unplug the life support of an interrogated target in the mech trenches. Another has you rescue a mech pilot from a mech suit. Along with the variety of quests, the expanding quantity available to you at any moment gives you greater freedom over what types of jobs you take. At the beginning of the game, you're only able to take the jobs Slade offers. Whatever he gives you, well, you have to do them. Then you're given a selection between 2 or 3 quests, then 5 or 7. By the end, you can pick between 15 or 20 odd quests that rotate. This grants you the opportunity to be more selective. If you want to do only offensive missions and take out targets, well, you can now do that. On the other hand, if you want to only keep low and just scavenge and extract, well, that's an option too. Then there's the progression of water. The more water you accumulate, the more vendors open up for you to trade with. More weapons become available. Goodbye rusty AK, hello advanced rifle with high-powered optics. With more vendors, more types of items become available to purchase, such as mercenaries. The vendors each have trust systems too. The more you trade with them, the more their trust will grow, and they will have more exclusive gear to offer you. Progression within progression. The cream of the crop is new backpacks. With better backpacks, you can offer what type of gear you want to haul. You can get a backpack with more large slots to carry out the big items. Before, you could only extract 1 water barrel at a time. Well, you can open that up to 2 or 3. Alternatively, you can offer backpacks with more weapon carriers or ammo slots if you're going on the offensive end. Lastly, there are also base upgrades. These mainly increase your water supply. But on top of these upgrades, there's also character XP. You can pick which survivor you play as, and they each have slightly different traits. I went with the Masked Man because his weapon-oriented playstyle suited me, and well, I just think he looks the coolest. The XP works in a really unique way. You're able to use experience points to unlock talents, such as equipping heavier rifles or having more accurate fire with a weapon type. And no, that's not the unique part. There is a cap on each character you can earn. Once they hit the limit, you're able to prestige them. Then your character gets increased base statistics like faster movement speed and more health in exchange for losing all the acquired talents. It creates this loop where you're constantly unlocking traits, all the while your character is steadily growing stronger. I didn't do any extensive testing, but it felt like my character could take a lot more damage by the end of my play session than at the beginning. None of these types of upgrades are trivial. They affect your time in the wastelands in a very tangible way. Backpacks expand your efficiency, new weapons make you deadlier, mercenaries provide you backup out in the wastelands. Better character survival and perks makes you move better and live longer. But the most important of all is that you as the player are getting tangibly better at the game. After playing these maps, you start to understand what routes are the safest and which are the most dangerous. You start to understand what's safe and what's risky, when to lean towards a juicier reward and when to hold back. You get better at when to take on fights, and you get better at fighting them. You learn when to hold your ground and when to flee. Now, even if I was to start off a raid with only the basic equipment, I would still fare far, far better now than when I initially started to play. So when you combine your increased skill with all the upgrades in the game, you go from a weak, vulnerable scab to a formidable threat in the wastelands. Can you take on an entire army by yourself? Still no. But a squad? Yeah, absolutely. You may return to pick out the rest if they're also in your way. By the end of my journey, I wasn't just prey. I was also a predator in these wastes. I would hire mercs to take out high priority targets with me. I would go hunting instead of merely just staying alive. So I'm going to try to put together these elements and explain what makes the Forever Winter such a unique experience. As I've talked about, the Forever Winter offers a moment-to-moment gameplay rhythm that is wholly unlike any other game I've played, and that largely comes from how the enemy factions change their priority based on the circumstances. It creates this almost contradictory mix of unpredictability yet predictability at the same time. You know your enemies see you as the lowest on the totem pole, unless you give them a reason to do otherwise, and you can use this to your advantage. During my playtime, I baited enemies into attacking each other for my own benefit. Yet at the same time, all the variables at play make for a very dynamic and ever-changing experience. One faction may take out the other faster than you expected, or they may rout unexpectedly, leaving you square in their sights when they have no option but to fire. It's an ever-changing puzzle, one that you're constantly working through and making micro decisions and gambles that are exhilarating. For instance, I had multiple intense encounters right at the extraction point of Scorched Enclaves. Once a mech dropped right at the exit. Despair filled me, and there's no way I could take this thing on. But then I noticed an enemy squad near the mech. I waited until they opened fire, and I decided to risk it. I bull rushed forward, squeezing right by the mech, knowing I was just one bad glance away from getting obliterated by either it or the enemy squad. Another time, I had safely made it to the exit of the Scorched Enclaves. Safety was before me, and I had already packed a bunch of loot. However, I had an active quest to retrieve drone parts. I saw warring drones in the sky, and one that had the parts I needed was felled. I had to make a decision, risk my loot and go for the drop, or extract with my valuable loot and try again another day. I decided to go for it, and man, that was an intense experience. I think these stories demonstrate the constant decisions you're making about the enemy factions and how they'll react, plus the general risk and reward decisions that are inherent in an extraction game. But that's another thing too. I want to keep telling stories about my time in the game. That's because the Forever Winter's dynamic nature makes it a game that generates unique and interesting stories. It creates these truly cinematic moments that make you feel like a character in a post-apocalyptic movie. But on top of the rush in-game, the game's progression sinks its teeth into you. You're constantly building your power, so to speak. But it's not a straight line. When you die, you lose out all that you're carrying. You sometimes have to spend money that you've been saving up to purchase new weapons and ammunition to replace that which you've lost. It's the constant climb, and the tangible benefits that come with it, plus the drama of the setbacks, that makes the progression an equally compelling driver. Your time in the Wasteland is filled with drama, suspense, and anxiety, and it gives you memorable experiences. The progression climb gives structure and reason for each of your extraction attempts. It's a game where you're constantly oscillating from feeling like a hero and feeling like a victim. It's a game that puts as much adversity in your way as possible, yet it gives you the tools to succeed. That is another thing I noticed about the Forever Winter's design. Despite its rough exterior, it's secretly a game that wants you to thrive. I judge this based on a few mechanics. First and most importantly, the economy of this game is very forgiving. I always felt like I had money to buy the things I needed, and I could sustain myself for runs while saving up towards more expensive items like backpacks. And that's even when I would fail multiple extraction attempts in a row. And there's always the final safety net of the surplus AK and shotgun. You can buy surplus rounds for the AK entirely for free, so no matter what, you'll always have a chance to build yourself back up. In addition, you get a chance to recover your lost loot on a map, so even if you die and lose your stuff, there is the immediate hope that you can get it back. On top of all of this, the Forever Winter takes place in a truly captivating world. The environmental storytelling is top-notch. It's a world that feels alive, yet completely and utterly filled with death. From the sickly vibes of the mech trenches, with its litany of body bags and blood packs, to the fiery apocalypse of the Scorched Enclaves, to the war-torn trenches of the Elephant Mausoleum, to the buried ruins of the Ashen Mesa, the Forever Winter creates a world that is vivid in its destruction and diverse in how it is depicted. And it's a world that breathes as much by its gameplay systems as by its art design. It all just comes together as a cohesive vision. I think the best example of this is the environmental system, particularly in the Scorched Enclaves. Regions in the Forever Winter have a varying weather time system. Based on the time of day / weather, the environment will change, and there will be different enemies that prowl the wastes. The Scorched Enclaves, during the day, is a fiery red hellscape torn apart by a constant war. there is a steady stream of gunfire, punctuated by rapid explosions. Warring factions run at each other, get torn apart, only for reinforcements to fill the gaps. It's a meat grinder. But at night, the Scorched Enclave takes on an entirely different identity. The environment takes on a cool tone and it's quiet, deathly quiet. The soft howling of the wind rules the night. Mounds of bodies now surround you, which you use for cover. Sparse enemies roam the land. There are large collectors who wander and gather the remains of the dead. These two states of the Scorched Enclave tell the story of the land. During the day, it's ravaged by the Forever War. By nighttime, there are so many dead and the fighting ceases. The collectors gather and dispose of the bodies, all so that the fighting can begin anew come dawn. It's a harrowing and depressing tale, and it's all depicted without the game having to say a word about it. So the varying environments serve the storytelling and immersive purpose, while the varying environments also provide a different style of gameplay. Less enemies means less distraction for those enemies, which means you're more prompted to take on a stealth approach. This sort of thing is what I mean when I say the game comes together cohesively. The world complements the gameplay, and the gameplay complements the world. All of this is accompanied by an awesome soundtrack that perfectly evokes the mood that the game is going for. I haven't talked much about it, but well, it's just incredible. So let's put this all together. The Forever Winter is a game set in a world that is stunning in its immersion, created by its beautiful art direction and its horror. The gameplay complements the world, and it offers a genuinely unique experience. This is enhanced by a progression system that makes you truly feel like you're developing your capabilities. The Forever Winter was my most hyped game this year. And for me, well, even in this early state, this was the experience I was hoping for. I've spent all this time going over the game's positives. But with all of that said, the Forever Winter is still in early access. It's far from a perfect game, and well, I want to go over where the game stumbles. Before we get into the negatives, I want to leave a quick plug for my book. I'm the author of a post-apocalyptic dystopia series called the Northfield Saga. While the world drowns in toxic gas, Mark Northfield desperately holds onto his sense of humanity. He's faced with a choice: assassinate a man or be killed. Little does he know, his target holds the key to saving the world. If you like the Forever Winter, well, I think there's a good chance you would like my series too. It would mean a lot if you checked it out and supported my work. Links are in the video description. Thanks for listening. Okay, now onto the Forever Winter's negatives. So clearly I have a lot of love for this game. However, it's far from perfect, and there's still a lot of work to be done. The developers have been vocal about using this early access time to garner feedback from the community, and it's one of the reasons the game has been released in such an early state. With that said, I think it's important to address the issues in the game, both for potential players and for the developers. The developers may never see this video, but nonetheless I hope this feedback reaches their ears in one way or another. I'll start off with the boring issues: performance and stability. To be honest, both of these are a little better than I was expecting given the game's early access. I actually had pretty decent performance on my computer with solid frames and very few frame drops. However, a lot of people have been having trouble running this game, so clearly issues do exist with the game's optimization. The stability as far as bugs actually hasn't been as bad as I expected either. I didn't run into any that seriously inhibited my ability to play. I didn't have any glitches with quests, or hard crashes, or instances where I fell under the environment and needed to restart. I didn't even get stuck on the geometry, which happens to me even with AAA games. Perhaps the worst offender I experienced was when I hired a mercenary to deploy with me. They didn't spawn, yet I lost them, which was a waste of my credits. Of course, this is another thing that varies per person, and the mileage seems to vary widely. With that said, although there weren't a lot of showstopper bugs, I experienced a lot of minor issues. The most prevalent was graphical and animation glitches. Enemies had a tendency to bob up and down whenever they ran into a particularly tricky piece of geometry, and they would glitch out on their patrol paths. I couldn't seem to go 5 minutes without hitting a bug of this kind, and these issues do pull you out of that immersion. Given how much the Forever Winter prides itself on immersion, I think these issues are critical to stamp out, even if they don't directly affect gameplay. There's also an undeniable level of jankiness that is present in gameplay. Perhaps the worst offender is enemy detection. As I mentioned earlier, the enemies have complicated AI, using a system of precedence to determine who to attack. So with that said, it makes sense that sometimes enemies would attack you and sometimes they wouldn't, even if you're in the same proximity and sightline, depending on what other threats are around. I understand that's how it's supposed to work. Still, there's something that feels just off about it. There were times when I was surprised I got detected, and there were other times that I just couldn't believe the enemies weren't shooting at me. It just felt wildly unpredictable. Maybe this is all a skill issue. I could believe that. Everything could be working as intended. However, if that's the case, I think the game needs to communicate more information about the enemy's state to the player. I think they're a bit too hard to read right now. Of course, some level of AI unpredictability keeps things fresh and exciting. But at the same time, this is a game where death means you lose all your loot. When the stakes of death are so high, I want to feel like the deaths are caused by my mistake or miscalculation, not the game being inconsistent. This feeling of inconsistency is exacerbated by enemy spawns. These are also janky. I had times where an enemy squad would spawn on top of me, like literally pop out of the sky on top of me. It didn't happen super often, but it was enough to, again, add to this feeling of inconsistency. I also think the player movement and controls could use work. The biggest issue in this regard by far is looting. There were so many times that I wanted to pick up a gun off the ground, but I couldn't, because there was another piece of loot blocking it. Sometimes I wouldn't want to grab what was in a loot container because I didn't want to fill my backpack. I spent so much time fiddling around, trying to aim at the exact pixel that the game wanted me to so I could pick up the item I actually wanted. In a game where you want to keep moving to extraction and keep your head on a swivel for enemies, this clunky looting experience is terrible. It was something I felt like I was actively fighting against every single run I did. Aside from better looting, my biggest request from a character control perspective is the ability to shoulder swap. This is a very standard feature in third-person shooters, and I think it's especially needed in the Forever Winter. Because the camera is always over the right shoulder, I could peek around cover from my right, but not from my left. There are so many times I wanted to peek around the left corner, but I couldn't. I get it's not realistic, but games have to find a balance between gameplay and realism. In this case, I think the gameplay benefit vastly outweighs the cost. It's another thing I found myself wishing for on every single run. On the mission and level design front, the balancing felt off too. Some areas are way easier to extract from than others. The cemetery and Scorched Enclave and the elevator and mech trenches were super easy to extract from. I could dart from one end of the map to the other in 2 or so minutes. Ashen Mesa, on the other hand, feels like a trek to traverse in comparison. Now don't get me wrong, I think having variety and difficulty in map size is great for the game. The problem is, I don't feel like the game incentivized me enough to run the harder levels. The loot, at least to me, seemed just about as good. At least, it was close enough to me that running the harder maps never felt worth the risk, when I could instead run through an easy level over and over again, sell items to vendors, and buy my loot from them. This is alleviated somewhat when you unlock more factions that give you quests. Some quests are only in specific zones, which does incentivize you to explore them. Still, I found myself leaning towards accepting quests in the easy zones over the hard ones. Even with the harder quests that had 100,000 credit payouts, I figured it would be easier for me to grind out Scorched Enclave and get those 100,000 credits by selling items. I don't have a ton of suggestions for this, except maybe to offer higher level loot in the harder areas. Again, maybe the game is already doing this. I didn't do an in-depth analysis of the loot table. However, if there is a distinction, it was too small for me to notice. For instance, I got a high-level weapon, the Vector, in the Scorched Enclave. The worst offender of balance issues are the timed extractions. In the Forever Winter, there are 2 types of extraction. There are normal extractions where you have to just reach the exfil point. Then there are timed extractions. As the name indicates, when you reach the extraction point, you need to hold off until the timer reaches 0. The problem is, when you start the timer, the game immediately spawns a ton of enemies that swarm your location. It's incredibly difficult, and I couldn't survive it. Even when I tried to hide, there were simply too many enemies, and one of the factions would find me and mow me down. I think these missions are way overtuned. Maybe they're designed for co-op, but even so, I think they need to be made easier when playing solo. Either spawn the enemies further away, or do less of them, or at least do something. Even if you disagree with making these timed extractions easier, I don't think there's any denying that the timed extractions are significantly harder than the non-timed versions. And again, the loot tables in these time zones feel the same. So I felt absolutely no incentive to struggle and die over and over again on these timed extractions, when I could instead easily run non-timed extractions. So I ended up avoiding these like the plague. With that in mind, I think there's definitely work to be done from a balancing perspective. So moving on from the technical things that need fixing, we're getting into my personal wish list. In short, I would just like to have more of the game in 2 main ways. First, I wanted more opportunities to dig into this world. When I found intel in the world, I was disappointed to see that it was a tradable item and not something you could actually read or listen to. Maybe I'm just a big dum-dum, but I did look for a way to listen to them and didn't find one. I think that in of itself is a compliment to the game. I'm generally not a text or audio log guy, but I found the Forever Winter's world so fascinating that I wanted to learn more about it and immerse myself in the setting more. I think there's an ample opportunity to do that here. Second, I would like more long-term progression. Once I had saved up and purchased the expensive backpack I wanted, I felt a bit of a plateau progression-wise. There was more to grind, don't get me wrong. I could have gone for the base upgrades, but none of them really motivated me. A larger water supply didn't feel that consequential. I could have grinded out more character levels too, but I don't know. To me at least, it just felt like the game is missing some longer term sense of progression to go for. I don't know what that could be exactly. Perhaps more elite weapons or high level areas that only unlock after certain criteria is met or something. It would be nice to have some feeling of endgame to move towards. And now we're getting into dream territory. The Forever Winter has a system where factions grow more powerful if you aid them more, and there's a slight narrative hook to this. It would be awesome if this system was developed further into a full-on narrative experience, where you can aid one faction or another to some conclusion. Now, I get the game is called the Forever Winter, and that the whole point is that factions are fighting in an endless war ad infinitum. Even within these confines, I think there's a way to weave a narrative, and a narrative payoff, into that framework. Some narrative hook could serve as that form of long-term progression too, instead of just gameplay incentives. Either way, I think I've made my point about things I wish for, and things that need to be improved. Fortunately, I think all the issues I've gone over are easily fixable. I have no doubt that with the right mindset and elbow grease, the developers can fix all these issues. However, I've left out the game's most critical and controversial problem. That's because I wanted to dedicate an entire section to it. What's this problem? Well, it's the water system. So I've touched a bit on the water system throughout this video. Now I'm going to go into even more detail. The water system in the Forever Winter is pretty straightforward. The innards has a water supply that steadily diminishes over time. The deplenish rate is 1 barrel of water per day, and that's real life days. 1 day in the game is 1 real life day. You can replenish water in one of two ways. First, by scavenging water barrels on runs. The second is by completing quests, many of which award barrels of water. If the innards runs out of water, essentially everyone dies. You lose all the gear you've stocked up. You lose access to all of the vendors, and you have to rebuild their reputations again. Some things remain, like character XP, but it's pretty darn close to a full game reset. So, let's say there are 6 days remaining in my water supply. Then I take a real life 7-day vacation. When I come back to the game, I would find everything deleted, and find myself back at square one. In essence, the game is punishing you for not playing it. I think most people intuitively grasp why the system is disliked and controversial. In fact, I think most people are inherently repulsed by it. I've seen countless comments from people who refuse to even pick up the game until this system is changed or fixed. It's an anti-player mechanic. The game is essentially holding your progress hostage so you keep playing. There were a few nights where I wanted to do something else, but I thought about my water running out and felt like I had to hop onto the game to build up my stash. The game is pervading outside of the game itself with this ticking time clock and making you feel punished for doing other things in your life. I'm amongst the crowd that thinks this is a terrible system, and I think it's the game's one true black eye. The developers seem to agree. They've already stated that they are going to create a Water 2.0 system. Who knows? By the time this video drops, the developers may have already announced their specific plans for revamping the system. But I'm going to go back to what I said in the intro. This is an early critique, and this is the mechanic I experienced while playing. So I'm going to cover it anyway. Think of it as a post-mortem or a time capsule. I've witnessed a segment of this budding community crop up that is very defensive of this mechanic, so I'm going to go over the most prominent defenses and rebut them, and explain why the system needs to go. The first defense is my least favorite. It's the argument that this is a hardcore game. If you don't like the water system, then you're just too soft of a player and that this game isn't meant for you. I strongly dislike this argument. First, I think it rings of elitism. I mean, man, we're all just here playing games. Secondly though, I think it's just a weak argument. The game is hardcore, yes, but just because a mechanic is quote-unquote hardcore doesn't automatically make a mechanic good or beneficial to the game. I think the best way to demonstrate this is by another example. Here's an idea for another hardcore mechanic. When you die in the game, you're locked out of playing it for an hour. That's hardcore too, right? It's anti-player and oppressive. It's bringing a time element from the real world into the game. And think of how much more intense it would make extractions. If you lose, you not only lose your stuff, you lose your ability to play too. You could even argue it from a realism perspective. that not being able to immediately respawn brings it a hair closer to real life. It's hardcore alright, but I think everybody would actively recoil if this system was introduced into the game, even the people who like the water system. Nobody would want this, yet you can make the exact same retort to anybody who criticizes it. This is a hardcore game and it's a hardcore mechanic. If you don't like it, you're just too soft, you're too casual. So this argument doesn't really do or say anything, it just comes across as antagonistic. This mechanic is hostile to the player, and I think its main downsides are apparent. In a PvE game, you're making the player fret about it in real life. The game is forcing you to play perpetually, otherwise you'll lose all your stuff. But I think it's even more damaging than many people realize. When people stop playing a game, there are two types of quitting, which I'm going to refer to as soft quitting and hard quitting. Soft quitting means that you're putting the game down for now, but you intend on or at least open to playing the game again in the future. Hard quitting is setting down a game, intending on never playing it again. Think of it as a break versus retirement. This water system encourages the latter. It's a system that's exhausting over time. Eventually, players are going to get sick of feeling like there's a ticking time clock over a game they're playing, and they're going to get fed up with it, so they'll stop. But the game is actively discouraging them from picking up the game and playing it again. The player knows that next time they pick up the game, everything they had will be gone. Do you think with that in mind, they're more likely to play the game or not? Aren't they more likely to just forget the game and go to one of the other games on the market? I think one of the other big issues that I haven't seen being brought up is the fact that the Forever Winter just doesn't have the content to support this mechanic. What do I mean by this? Well, as I said, this is a system that forces you to play the game perpetually. However, the game simply does not have enough content to play on a perpetual basis. Very few games do, especially ones in early access. After I unlocked my backpack, I felt like I had experienced most of what the game had to offer. I'd wager at this point, most players will get comfortably between 10 to 30 hours of enjoyment out of the game. Of course, there will be people who play for 700 hours, but I'm speaking of most people within the target audience. I think that's actually a great amount of time, and a great value for the game's price point. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Except the game doesn't want you to put it down. So you have this situation where the game wants you to play it more than most players will want to. That will lead to players playing it out of a sense of obligation or quitting, or likely doing both. That will lead to hard quitting because having all your stuff wiped is a bad feeling. The Forever Winter is in an early access state, which makes this especially bad. The developers should be encouraging the opposite right now. It should be actively encouraging people to return when new updates drop, and especially the 1.0 release. This is a stage of testing out the game, jumping out, and staying tuned for updates to jump back in. Right now, this water mechanic is actively driving people away once they've had their fill of the game. Okay, finally onto the second big defense of the game, and that's the water mechanic is very easy to keep replenished. It's barely an inconvenience, some people say. In an hour or two of grinding, you can build up 50 days of water. You really don't have to worry about it while you're playing. And while I actually agree with this statement, it is easy to get water. Once I had my upgraded backpack, I could grind out a run in the mech trenches to get 2 or 3 barrels of water, and this run took me less than 2 minutes. So if I did that for an hour, well, I'd be stocked up for months. So it's easy, but I actually think this fact makes this system even worse, not better. If it's easy and not an inconvenience, then it isn't adding anything to the experience while you're actively playing the game. It doesn't add any tension while you're playing, it doesn't add excitement, and it doesn't increase your immersion. So it's a mechanic that adds nothing to the game itself, and it sorely punishes you outside of the game for taking long breaks. In a PvE game that can be played offline, this in of itself is enough to justify cutting this mechanic from the game or at least revising it, which it sounds like the developers are going to do, so that's great news. I know I went a little hard on this point, but I've seen so much defense of this mechanic, and I wanted to say my piece before it goes away, and why it needed to go away. As I said, I do think it's the game's worst aspect, so it warrants this segment in the video. Okay, so we've gone through the good and the bad of the Forever Winter. In the first month of early access, where does it stand? The Forever Winter is rough around the edges, and it certainly has its flaws. Some people say it's way too underbaked, but I think it's more baked than people give it credit for. Most importantly, I think the Forever Winter did deliver on its promises. It promised a truly immersive and dark post-apocalyptic world with a gameplay system that was similarly immersive and original. On this promise, I believe the Forever Winter delivered in spades. The Forever Winter simply oozes this unique vibe of wonder and despair. soul-crushing despair. The gameplay with its warring factions delivers an experience that is wholly unlike any other game I've played. The gameplay has a unique rhythm and pattern to its decision-making that stands apart. Just as importantly, the gameplay is immersive, and it feeds back into the immersion that the world provides. Is the Forever Winter a masterpiece? Well, no, not just yet. There's an undeniable level of jank in its animation and gameplay systems. The water system as of making the script is its biggest sore spot. And past just the flaws, I would just love more of this world. I would personally love a way to dig more into it, be it through audio text logs or more of an actual in-game story. I think its current systems could be expanded as well, and the long-term progression increased. But all of these are very fixable problems in time. These are not root-level issues with the game. From the developers' response so far, they seem passionate about fixing up the game as quickly as possible, and are super responsive to feedback. The Forever Winter's future seems to be all sunshine. All in all, it's a truly special game even in its current state, and while in as short of a sentence as possible, that's what I really wanted from the Forever Winter. A game that felt special. One that had that certain indelible sense of soul. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to support me even further, please consider checking out the Northfield saga. If you're interested in the Forever Winter, I think it would be truly up your alley. I appreciate your support as always. Until next time.